we are now. I've got a bit of a presentation, sort of a stage setting thing. How many folks that are in here now weren't in here for Eleanor's talk? Okay, a number of you. Good. Because I'm talking about a number of very similar things to what she talked about. A little bit different slides, I think. But good to know that you don't already know it all. Otherwise I'd have to skip it and then I wouldn't know what to do. So a few different things that we are going to cover here just to start out. A little bit of a discussion on watersheds and the water cycle. Talk a little bit about land use and indicators of water quality, and that's really what's going to set us up for our conservation design exercise. Talk a little bit about polluted runoff, and then we'll actually get into actually doing the designs on the maps and try your hand at that. So we'll spend some time at that, and then we'll wrap up with some additional details about conservation design at the end. All right, so this is a lake watershed. I live up in Duluth, and I do a lot of work on Lake Superior, so I just picked the Lake Superior watershed. It's easy. Of course, every lake, every stream, every wetland has its own watershed. And each of those, in some watersheds, bigger ones in particular, you can divide up into smaller pieces. And you can look at even smaller pieces sometimes, at least for the Lake Superior watershed. You can get down to these very, very minor watersheds. These are the Minnesota watersheds that drain into Lake Superior. There's about 450 of these little guys on the North Shore. But each of these little teeny pieces of land drain to one particular lake or stream or wetland. And it's the watershed for that particular lake or stream or wetland. Now, of course, they all flow together, and eventually all of the water in these watersheds ends up in Lake Superior. So we're going to look at just one of those watersheds in an air photo. This is Sargent Creek. It's in the western side of Duluth. It runs and flows into the St. Louis River. And of course, there's a variety of things on the land in this watershed. You can see the stream flowing through here, branching out in a few different spots. You see there's roadways, and there's railroads, and gravel road up here, some housing up here, some industrial sites here, forest land, grassland, a whole variety of things happening throughout the watershed. But of course, the reason that watersheds are important is that if you're concerned about what's happening here as far as water quality, you have to look at what's happening throughout this whole watershed. Even if you're nowhere near the stream, you can't see water. You know, you're standing up in the woods here, you can't see any water anywhere around you, but it's still important. What happens there is still important for the water quality on this site here. So that's the reason that those watersheds are so important. That water flows across the land and reaches those streams, and how that water moves across the land and what they carry all impact the water quality at that downstream site, whether it's a stream like this or if it's a lake or a wetland even. So yeah, so this is something that all of us learned back in, I don't know, 5th grade, 6th grade or something, the water cycle in high school or in grade school, how water moves across our environment. There's a particular stretch in here that I'm most interested in, however. When it rains, water's usually pretty clean. You know, we catch it in barrels and we put it in our plants, and you know, it's pretty clean stuff for the most part. When it gets down into the lake, though, or into the streams, oftentimes it's not very clean. And so, of course, then something's happening between those 2 points to make that water not very clean. So we're going to follow that, a few raindrops a little bit, and try to figure out, and of course, this is a pretty intelligent audience. Many of you probably know these things, but you know, kind of get everybody on the same page here. Follow a few of those raindrops and just sort of see what happens to those. So let's pretend we're out in the woods somewhere in some natural environment place, and it starts to rain. What's the first thing those raindrops are going to hit as they're falling down towards the ground? Vegetation? Yeah, trees, leaves, right? Yeah, exactly. How many folks have ever been outside when it's rained and you run under a tree to stay dry a little bit? All of us, right? It works because those trees, those leaves catch a lot of rain. Turns out they really catch a lot of rain. Up to 50% of a typical rainfall can get caught by the leaves or the needles of a tree. That's water that gets caught up in the air and doesn't reach the ground at all. So that's a lot of water that gets caught by those trees in a forested area. And of course the water will filter down through those trees eventually, you know, whether there's gaps in the trees, you know, the leaves only hold so much, or the lucky raindrop hits the gap, whatever happens there. And then it might catch on the vegetation that's down in the understory of the forest and fill up that, fill up those leaves. Then of course that water is going to get down further and down into the ground. And at first you're going to have some infiltration. Of course, water is going to infiltrate down into the ground, especially in forested areas where you have that, you know, that nice, soft, mucky, organic layer on top of the soil, old leaves and old needles, that duff layer that really absorbs and can hold a lot of water, really just like a sponge. It just can soak that water up and hold it right in place. So you get water infiltrating down into the ground, soaking up into the leaves and the organic matter, and then of course water flows downhill once it can't soak in anymore. The vegetation is all full of water. it starts to move downhill. And it's going to go, you know, if the water fell here, that's going to be downhill for the first stop, right? Whatever's right downhill, it's going to go. And if there's a pool there, if there's a spot for it to collect, it's going to collect there and fill up. So it might be a footprint. That's what that is. I think it's a deer print that it's going to fill up. It might be a little bit bigger, a little puddle like this that it's going to fill up. And that's going to fill up and hold that water. Because of course the floor of forests isn't flat like lawns or parking lots. You know, there's trees that have fallen over, there's rocks, there's logs, all these things that make the floor of a forest very rough and bumpy. Lots of places that are going to catch and hold water in place on the floor of that forest. Then of course there can be bigger wetlands, ponds or other things that are further downstream that are going to collect that water. And all of that together, all of those things across the landscape can sometimes be referred to as storage. Wetlands is one of the most common ones we have. But all of those structures all across the landscape that hold on to water and hold it in place can be sort of referred to generally as storage. And it's holding that water in place so it's not running off. And of course eventually then that water will make it, you know, the wetlands are full, the soil's full, everything's full, water will flow across the landscape and eventually it will reach streams and down bigger streams and eventually down to a lake or, you know, eventually down to the ocean and evaporates and it comes back on land, right? So that's sort of how it naturally happens. What alters this process? All sorts of stuff. It's this little wood chip path through the woods here up in Duluth. You can see the water was flowing this way. It hit this trail and it turned and went down this hill. You can even see a little bit of erosion starting right there. So it's just a little wood chip path through the wood. It has altered the way water flows across this landscape. Granted, not a lot. Probably not a big deal, but it has changed the way water flowed across this landscape. Of course, we do slightly larger alterations to our landscape. We do a little bit more of the wood chip paths, roads, ditches, things that channelize water. We remove vegetation, so all of those leaves that used to be catching that water are now gone, and that water is hitting directly on top of the soil. If we scrape that soil off, we lose all that organic matter that used to hold water. Maybe we make it nice and flat, so there's no storage left on that surface, so the water flows off very easily. And we also add impervious surfaces, rooftops and roads and parking lots and other things, and curbs and gutters that are designed to carry that water very quickly to the nearest water body, whether it's a stream or a lake or whatever it might be. So we do some pretty dramatic changes to our landscape, and that, of course, dramatically then changes the way water moves across our landscape. And it turns out there's three things on the landscape that are really good indicators of water quality. And you won't be surprised to hear any of them. One of them is forest cover. And of course, older trees are more important than younger trees. You know, you plant a little sapling in your yard. It's a great thing to do, but it's not going to do a lot of good for a while until it grows up and it gets bigger and it gets the bigger canopy. So older trees, of course, are more important. When you remove those old trees, research has found that you see that streams have become unpredictable. Rainfalls come and the streams are more flashy. You get bigger runoff events. Water that used to get caught, again, by those leaves, now just drops right on the land and will rush up and more of that water will run off. Snowmelt runoff peaks are higher. When you have forest covering the land, that forest, even deciduous forest, is going to provide some shade. It's going to slow down the melting of that snow. When you remove that forest cover, that snow melts faster and all at the same time, and so it all runs off at the same time. So you get bigger peak snowmelt runoffs. Water temperatures increase, sediment and nutrient export also increase. Obviously, when you're removing shade, you're going to warm up the water. When you're removing those roots and you're causing more water to run off, that water is going to carry more sediment and it's going to carry more nutrients. So you see those things increase as well. Storage is the other